Chapter 1. The Bleeding Dusk. The air above the Basalt Spires tasted of ash and regret. It had been a year since the burning noon descended, a sky perpetually bleached white, a result of the Umbral Eclipse's slow, deliberate consumption of the world's shadows. Before, the sun had been a brutal tyrant, scorching the skin and drying the rivers. Now it was a distant, indifferent glare, a reminder of what they'd lost. The High Lantern Kingdom of Viridia, once famed for its artisans and its mastery of solar magic, was reduced to a brittle expanse of white stone and desperate flickering lanterns. The Deep-Cavern Clan of the Stone-Hand Orcs, historically masters of tunneling and subterranean warfare, were trapped in a perpetual twilight, their once booming forges muted by the relentless glare. And the Twilight-Weave Elves, guardians of ancient lore and subtle magic, were reduced to a spectral flicker, their connection to the natural world and to shadow itself severed. Captain Kalen, a human oil burner of the Viridian Guard, adjusted the heavy leather strap of his lantern, the flickering light casting a grotesque dance upon the cracked basalt. His unit, the Obsidian Blades, were tasked with holding the western flank of the spires, a task that had become little more than a slow, agonizing attrition. He was a veteran, scarred, not just by battle but by the creeping sense of emptiness, the unsettling feeling that something vital was being stolen from him, from everyone. He hadn't spoken of it, not even to his closest comrade Barren, a young, restless scout, barely out of his training. "Another dead-end, Captain," Barren grunted, kicking at a loose shard of basalt. 3 days. Just dust and echoes. The light shields are useless. They burn through our flesh before they even register a contact. Kalen felt a familiar surge of frustration. The light shields were the newest weapon issued by the High Solar Master Silas Thorn, a grandiose title for a man obsessed with artificial illumination. Thorn believed that the key to victory lay in maximizing light, eradicating shadow entirely. Had justified deploying these strange devices, shimmering silver plates that momentarily intensified the sun's glare, as a tactical advantage. But Kalen was beginning to suspect something far more sinister. "They're not protecting us, Barren," Kalen said, his voice low, careful. "They're taking us." Barren frowned, clearly unconvinced. "Taking? What do you mean?" "I've been watching the skirmishes," Kalen explained, pointing to a distant flash of white light. "The light shields aren't simply reacting to our movements. They're detaching our shadows. I've seen soldiers, fully armored, their shadows simply vanish. Then they collapse, drained, unresponsive. It's as if they're pulling something fundamental from their beings." The idea was unsettling, a violation of something deeply ingrained in their very existence. Orcs, for instance, were intrinsically linked to the dark earth, their shadow a tangible representation of their connection to the stone hand. Elves, bound to the weave of twilight, relied on their shadows for stealth and power. Humans, traditionally reliant on the sun's warmth and vitality, drew strength from the contrast of light and dark. To have that fundamental connection severed, it was madness. Their unease was echoed by Torvin Stonehand, an Orcish tunnel scout from the Deep-Cavern Clan. Torvin, a grizzled veteran with eyes like chips of obsidian, led a small team of miners and warriors who were tasked with mapping the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the spires. Torvin's reports were consistently unsettling. "The drill's there pulling something out of the rock," he reported through the comm slate, his voice a low rumble. "Not just minerals. The air it's thinner. The shadows, they're fewer. Less." Meanwhile, deep within the Silverwood, Ilara Whisperwind, an elven weaver's apprentice, was experiencing a similar disconcerting shift. She and her mentor, Master Lyrian, were tasked with maintaining the ancient weave nodes, intricate magical structures that allowed the elves to manipulate and channel the twilight. Lately the weave nodes were failing, flickering erratically, and Ilara noticed something even more alarming. Her own shadow was fading. It was becoming indistinct. as if the very fabric of her being was being bleached by the relentless sun. "The flow is strained, Ilara," Lyrian said, his voice etched with concern, "as if a vital artery has been pinched. And I sense corruption, a dissonance within the weave. Something is stealing the essence of shadow." The three, separated by hundreds of miles and vastly different cultures, were unknowingly drawn together by a horrifying realization they were not fighting a war against the Umbral Eclipse, but were themselves being deliberately sacrificed to it. They were pawns in a game orchestrated by a clandestine alliance master, Silas Thorn, Pit-Boss Grok the Obsidian, and Shade-Stitcher Lyra Nightshade, the architects of the Silhouette Cartel. A trio determined to erase the world's memories and usher in an age of perfect, sterile light, a fate orchestrated by the Umbral Eclipse itself. They were, unknowingly, feeding the entity's hunger. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Black. The grit of the salt flats clung to Kalen's oil-stained tunic, a constant reminder of his duty. Had been tracking the movements of the High Lantern Legion for 3 days, a lone oil burner scout tasked with verifying the unsettling reports. The reports, dismissed by Captain Vorin as desert madness, detailed a systematic drain of shadow from the troops, a thinning of their very being. Kalen, a man forged in the heat of the forge and steeped in the stubborn pragmatism of his people, had started to see the truth himself. The soldiers were hollower, less defined. He shifted his gaze, scanning the bleached horizon. The white expanse, once a daunting battlefield, now felt impossibly vast, sterile. The High Lantern's light shields, touted as the pinnacle of their sun-resistant magic, were now a source of chilling dread. Had witnessed a squad advance, shields raised, and watched as a young soldier, a fresh-faced recruit named Torin, simply dissolved. Not violently, not with a scream, but with a fading of light, a shrinking of his shadow until he was left a gray silhouette, utterly devoid of animation. His comm crystal crackled to life. The voice of Bryn, the tunnel scout. "Kalen, report. We've got a situation. Grid Sector Gamma 7. The light shields are active, and they're right, like they're drawing the shadows. I saw a whole company just fade away." "Confirmed," Kalen responded, his voice tight. "Vorin's ignoring us. He's doubled down on the brightness protocols. It's like he wants this." He adjusted the focusing lens on his heat sight, intensifying the already stark glare. In the distance, he spotted the lumbering advance of the High Lantern Legion, a wave of white and gold, relentlessly pushing towards a distant ridge, a ridge which, under normal circumstances, would offer a haven of dark. Meanwhile, deep within the Silverwood, Ilara's fading shadow was a torment. It wasn't a gradual lessening, it was as if someone were actively erasing it, pixel by pixel. She had tried everything Master Lyrian taught her, reinforcing the weave node with intensified twilight patterns, layering protective wards of shadow silk, reciting the ancient prayers of the Twilight-Weave. Nothing. The node pulsed with a weak, erratic throb, and her own shadow continued to diminish, clinging to her like a spectral shroud. "The weave is resisting, Ilara," Lyrian said, his brow furrowed with an intensity she rarely saw. "It's not simply weakened, it's infected. The dissonance you feel, it's not just a sensory disturbance. It's a negation, a deliberate erasure of our connection to the shadow." He gestured to a complex diagram woven into the floor, depicting the interconnectedness of the weave nodes. One of the diagrams pulsed with a sickly gray light. "I've sent a signal to the Elder Council," Lyrian continued, his voice grim. "They are convening an emergency session, but I fear the damage is already too extensive. I've been researching ancient texts, and I've found a fragmented record of a similar event, a nulling that occurred during the age of shifting stars. It was attributed to a being that fed on memory, a collector of lost shadows." As Lyrian spoke, a tremor ran through the Silverwood, and Ilara instinctively reached out, attempting to grasp her fading shadow. Suddenly, a voice, cold and laced with amusement, cut through the silence. Interesting. A weaver struggling with the absence of darkness. How efficient. The voice belonged to Silas Thorn, the Grand Solar, a figure of chilling elegance, clad in polished white armor that reflected the relentless sun. He wasn't visible, not exactly. Instead, he projected his image, a shimmering, almost holographic representation, into the Weave Node's chamber. Thorn was a master of manufactured light, his power fueled by an intricate network of sun reflectors and prisms. His very presence felt like an assault on the senses. You sense a corruption, Weaver. How delightful. You are quite perceptive. Thorn smiled, a chilling, utterly devoid of warmth expression. I've been observing your difficulties. Allow me to offer a little assistance. This, he gestured with a shimmering hand, and a small dark orb materialized, pulsing with an unnatural, contained shadow. This is a dusk seed, a concentrated essence of collected shadows. Consume it, and you may find your shadow restored. Lyrian recoiled, his eyes wide with horrified recognition. That's a stolen shadow, Ilara. A fragment of a memory ripped from someone's soul. Just as Thorn's words finished echoing, a guttural shout tore through the salt flats. Hold your ground, lanterns! For the light! Bryn's voice, frantic and strained, crackled through Kaelin's comm. They're amplifying the light shields. They're concentrating the shadows. Imsaying, and Taya's squads turned to ash. The realization slammed into Kaelin with the force of a physical blow. Thorn wasn't offering assistance, he was actively feeding the Umbral Eclipse, accelerating the destruction. The entire conflict, the war, the bloodshed, it was all meticulously orchestrated. And he, along with Ilara, was a key component in the darkness' demise. The whispers of the Umbral Eclipse grew louder, no longer a distant threat, but a palpable presence, and he knew with chilling certainty that they weren't fighting to reclaim their shadows, but to become shadows themselves. Chapter 3. The Ink Blood Coup. The comms crackled with renewed urgency, punctuated by the sickening sizzle of dissolving flesh. Bryn's panicked shouts had devolved into a desperate, ragged stream of commands, attempting to rally the scattered remnants of the High Lantern's vanguard. Kaelin, report! What's the casualty count? We're losing men faster than we can bury them. Kaelin, still reeling from the revelation about Thorn and the Dusk Seed, forced himself to focus. His hand instinctively tightened around the grip of his void blade, the obsidian steel humming with the contained darkness, a desperately improvised weapon against a foe that thrived on absence. Casualty count is catastrophic, Bryn. The light shields aren't just detaching shadows, they're devouring them. Soldiers are simply ceasing to exist. We're fighting ghosts in a landscape of ash. He glanced at Ilara, who was rigidly clutching the Dusk Seed, her face pale, the unnatural darkness within the orb mirroring the growing dread in her eyes. Thorn is playing us, she said, her voice a strained whisper. He's not attempting to restore our shadows. He's fueling the eclipse. Suddenly, a grinding roar echoed across the salt flats, a sound that wasn't born of war, but of brutal, mechanical destruction. A contingent of Orcish tunnel scouts, led by the hulking figure of Vorlag, burst into their position, their heavy drills churning through the barren earth, ripping up sections of the Basalt Spire they'd been tasked with defending. Hold the line! Vorlag bellowed, his voice a deep rumble, amplified by a primitive vocal resonator. The lanterns are routing! They're fighting for nothing! Kaelin's eyes narrowed. Vorlag, previously a pragmatic and disciplined commander, was behaving with a manic desperation. The Orcs weren't fighting a coordinated defense, they were simply tearing through the landscape, engaging in a brutal, chaotic counterattack. Vorlag, what's your strategy? Kaelin demanded over the comms, his voice tight with suspicion. Strategy? Vorlag roared back, a savage laugh accompanying his words. There's no strategy, Lantern. Only annihilation. Thorn gave us orders. He said, embrace the void. That's when it hit. Kalen Vorlag wasn't merely following orders. He was actively participating in the destruction, willingly surrendering his shadow to the encroaching oblivion. Just then, a shimmering, almost translucent figure materialized beside them, Alara, moving with an unnerving grace. The veil is thinning, she announced, her voice strangely detached. The Umbral Eclipse is growing stronger. We cannot continue to fight a battle we cannot win. And what's your plan, Weaver? Kalen asked, his hand instinctively tightening around his void blade. Just surrender to the darkness? No, Alara replied, a flicker of something akin to resolve passing over her face. We will not surrender. We will rewrite the battle. We will fight with the very thing that is consuming us. With a swift, practiced movement, she drew a shimmering, thread-like strand from the dusk seed, weaving it into a complex pattern in the air. The strand pulsed with a dark, viscous energy, coalescing into a shimmering, silver-gray weapon, a weft sunder. It was a weapon of unraveling, designed to disrupt the very fabric of shadows. As she spoke, the High Lanterns, initially stunned, began to understand. Kalen saw it reflected in the confused faces of Bryn's remaining scouts, in the hesitant steps of Vorlag's orcs. They realized that Thorn's twisted offering hadn't been an invitation, but a command. The shadow they were fighting was not their own, but a fabricated lie. We need to break the light shields, Kalen said, his voice firm. Alara, the weft sunder Dawai. Bryn, coordinate a focused assault on the Lantern's command center. Vorlag, I need you to use your drills to create a breach, a black hole in the basalt. A tense silence followed, broken only by the crackling of the diminishing shadows and the increasingly frantic commands echoing over the comms. Then, with a primal roar, Vorlag launched his drills into a furious, devastating attack on the central spire, creating a gaping chasm that threatened to swallow the entire battlefield. As the first tendrils of the weft sunder lashed out, striking the shimmering light shields of a nearby lantern squad, a wave of chaos erupted. The shields shattered, releasing a cascade of shadow fragments that spiraled outwards, harmlessly dispersing. But as they did, Kalen noticed something extraordinary with each disruption of the light. The faces of the lanterns seemed less defined. Their expressions softened, their movements grew sluggish, as if the very essence of their identity was being drained away. It's not just destroying the shields, Alara exclaimed, her voice laced with horror. It's feeding them. We have to act now. The realization solidified into a desperate plan, the coup of the ink blood. A plan born not of strategy, but of utter, terrifying necessity. They would confront the cartels not with weapons, but with the absence of everything they sought to control. They would drown the light. Chapter 4. The Coup of the Ink Blood. The air thrummed with a palpable dread, a static charge of desperation. Kalen, Alara, Bryn, and Vorlag, a quartet born of disparate loyalties forged in the crucible of this dying world, moved with a grim precision, their faces illuminated by the unsettling glow of the diminishing shadows. The final, agonizing throes of the Umbral Eclipse were visible above, a monstrous white eye consuming the last vestiges of twilight. Bryn, the human strategist, a wiry man etched with the worry lines of 1,000 failed calculations, barked orders into his helmet's comm. Lantern squads are regrouping near the Obsidian Ridge. Standard light shields are up, but their deployment is erratic. They're panicking, Kalen. They're trying to create pockets of darkness themselves. Ineffective, Kalen muttered, adjusting the grip on his obsidian blade, a weapon crafted from solidified shadow and imbued with the last flickering embers of forgotten magic. They're feeding the monster, not fighting it. Vorlag, the Orcish tunnel scout, a mountain of scarred muscle and silent intensity, was a whirlwind of controlled destruction. The rhythmic clang of his massive drills, now repurposed into devastating siege weapons, reverberated through the salt flats. The fissure deepens. The rock is yielding to the darkness. It's a hunger, this thing. A relentless, cold hunger. He spat a thick stream of black ichor, a byproduct of the drill's accelerated entropy. We need to push deeper, Kalen. A true black hole will cleanse this place. Ilara, the Elven Weaver's apprentice, moved with a disconcerting grace, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns of the Weft Sunder spell. The amulet around her neck pulsed with a dull, suffocating darkness, mirroring the growing absence around her. The energy signature, it's intensifying. They're channeling more and more shadow from the soldiers. It's a horrifying symphony of oblivion. She paused, her brow furrowed. In detecting a secondary conduit, Kalen, a subterranean network beneath the Grand Solar's command center. They're drawing the shadows directly from the soldiers' wounds. The realization hit Kalen like a physical blow. It wasn't just a tactic, it was a deliberate act of annihilation, a systematic erasure of identity. He tightened his grip on his blade, the obsidian shard reflecting the monstrous white eye above. Bryn, I need you to shift your focus. Forget the lanterns. We're targeting the source. Bryn, momentarily stunned, quickly recovered. Acknowledged. Initiating a direct assault on the command center. Ilara, can you amplify the Weft Sunder's reach to cover the breach? Attempting, Ilara replied, her voice strained. The sheer volume of stolen shadow is overwhelming the spell. It's like trying to extinguish a wildfire with a single drop of water. Suddenly, Vorlag roared, a guttural explosion of fury. I've breached it. A cascade of shadow, thick as a storm, pouring from the chasm. The Grand Solar is screaming. The comms erupted with the chaos of a collapsing empire. Lanterns, their faces already blurred, were dissolving before their eyes, reduced to vacant, shimmering shells. The remaining soldiers, encased in the failing light shields, screamed silently as they were drained dry, their memories, their identities, their very being devoured. Then a new directive echoed from Bryn. We needed to route a focal point, a void to amplify the Weft Sunder. Vorlag, I need you to focus your drills on the central spire's core. Concentrate the darkness, create a singularity. Vorlag, without hesitation, slammed his drills into a renewed, even more ferocious assault on the spire. The ground buckled, the basalt groaned, and a terrifying plume of shadow erupted, swirling around the drill's head like a sentient vortex. Ilara channeled every ounce of her remaining energy, weaving a tapestry of pure, unadulterated darkness that wrapped around Vorlag's drills, bolstering the Weft Sunder's power. As the darkness intensified, the white eye above pulsed with a new, malevolent light. The air grew colder, thicker, and the screams of the dissolving soldiers faded into an eerie silence. Suddenly, Ilara cried out, "It's reacting! The Umbral Eclipse, it's not just consuming shadow. It's rejecting it. It's fighting back." And then a blinding wave of pure white light erupted from the spire, washing over the battlefield. Kalen instinctively raised his obsidian blade, channeling the last vestiges of his own shadow into a desperate shield. But it was no use. The light was beyond anything had ever encountered, a force of utter negation. Just as he thought all was lost, Bryn shouted, "The Grand Solar's light shields are failing. Their energy is overloading. The Darkwell amulets, they're imploding." The monstrous figure of the Grand Solar, a titan of artificial light and corrupted ambition, was collapsing, consumed by the very darkness he sought to eradicate. And as he fell, a final, desperate act of defiance, a concentrated burst of pure, agonizing blackness, filled the void left behind. The coup of the inked blood had begun. Chapter 5. The Echo of Oblivion. The air hung thick with the stench of burnt coal and ozone, a metallic tang layered over the lingering, acrid smell of dissolving flesh. The battlefield, once a chaotic scramble of desperate combatants, was now a scene of brutal, methodical dismantling. The remnants of the Silhouette Cartel's forces lay scattered across the salt flats, their armor blackened, their movements sluggish, almost dreamlike, as the last vestiges of the Umbral Eclipse's influence ebbed away. Kalen, still clutching his obsidian blade, felt a tremor of exhaustion that went deeper than mere physical fatigue. The sheer force of the light, the agonizing refusal of oblivion, had imprinted itself upon his very being. He stumbled, leaning heavily on Bryn, the Elven Weaver's apprentice, who was meticulously gathering shards of the Shade-Stitcher's former form, viscous, inky masses that pulsed with residual memories, like trapped echoes. "The wefts under it worked," Bryn murmured, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns woven into a fragment of the Shade-Stitcher's shattered silhouette. "But the eclipse, it doesn't simply dissolve. It resists. It's feeding on the backlash, on the disruption. It's growing stronger, sharper." Across the ravaged spire, the Orcish tunnel scout, Grun, a mountain of scarred muscle and raw determination, was overseeing the systematic collapse of the Pit-Boss drilling rig. The massive machines, once designed to gouge at the basalt, were now being leveraged to create a pocket of absolute darkness, crushing the Pit-Boss beneath a suffocating weight of rock and shadow. Grun, a veteran of 1,000 cavern wars, recognized the change instantly. "This isn't a simple defeat," he grunted, slamming a fist against a particularly stubborn gear. This feels hungry. Like a wound that needs to be cauterized, but cauterized with even more darkness." The human oil burner, Silas, a pragmatic and surprisingly brilliant engineer, was directing a team in the construction of massive smoke bombs. Had spent the last 24 hours adapting his knowledge of combustion and heat deflection, gleaned from designing siege weaponry, to this utterly unique situation. "We need a concentrated point of darkness," Silas shouted over the din, his face streaked with soot. "A void so profound, so absolute that it will overload the thing. The Umbral Eclipse isn't a ghost, it's a parasite, and a parasite needs a host. We're going to give it one." He gestured to a team loading the smoke bombs with crushed pitch and ground obsidian. "This isn't just about smothering light, it's about suffocating the essence of the thing." As the last smoke bombs were deployed, a chilling silence descended. The white eye in the sky seemed to pulse with a tighter, more deliberate rhythm, as if anticipating the final act. Then, a low, guttural chanting began, emanating not from the remaining cartel forces, but from the assembled armies of the High Lantern, the Deep-Cavern Clan, and the Twilight-Weave Elves. It wasn't a coordinated war cry, it was something older, something primal. A gathering of collective shadow, a surge of remembered darkness, a desperate, unified plea to reclaim what had been stolen. The High Lantern's warriors, clad in blackened steel, began to manipulate ancient runes etched into their armor, drawing upon the forgotten art of null weaving, a technique that focused on disrupting energy fields rather than directly destroying. The Orcs, led by the grizzled war chief Baruch, unleashed a barrage of specially crafted voidstone projectiles, dense, obsidian fragments that generated localized pockets of absolute nothingness. The elves, guided by Alara, wove intricate patterns of darkness with their hands, creating temporary barriers that seemed to absorb light itself. Suddenly a tremor ran through the entire battlefield. Not an earthquake, but a ripple of displaced shadow, a physical manifestation of the collective effort. "Ow!" The white eye above shuddered, its blinding light flickering erratically. "It's working," Kalen shouted, his voice hoarse with effort. "We're building a wall of oblivion." But the eclipse wasn't passively resisting. It lashed out, sending tendrils of pure white energy that shattered the null weaves, disrupted the voidstone projectiles, and dispersed the elven shield. The chaos intensified, threatening to unravel the carefully constructed strategy. Then, from the heart of the collapsing drill, a voice, thin and fragmented, echoed across the salt flats. It was the Pit-Boss, his consciousness fractured and warped by the eclipse's influence, but still clinging to a semblance of his former self. Foolish mortals, you cannot fight the inevitable. The darkness is the beginning. The end. As the last vestiges of his voice faded, a final, overwhelming blast of light erupted from the Pit-Boss' now completely dark cavern, pushing back against the accumulated shadows, attempting to extinguish them entirely. Elara, seeing the shift in momentum, let out a desperate cry. We need more. We need all the darkness we can muster. Focus on the projection, on the eye. Let's drown it in ourselves. And as the armies of the High Lantern, the Deep-Cavern Clan, and the Twilight-Weave Elves poured their remaining shadows into the effort, a single, overwhelming thought crystallized in Kalen's mind: this isn't just a war against a creature. It's a battle for the very nature of existence. Chapter 6. The Echo of Absence. The air thrummed, thick with the stench of ozone and burnt coal. The white glare of the Umbral Eclipse, though diminished, still pressed down, a suffocating blanket of unnatural light. Kalen, sweat plastering his dark hair to his forehead, staggered back from the wreckage of the drill platform, his hand instinctively reaching for the worn leather of his shadow-binding rune. The rune pulsed faintly, struggling to maintain a coherent shape against the oppressive light. "It's incredible," muttered Borak, the tunnel scout, his Orcish features grim with exhaustion and a strange, almost reverent awe. He meticulously examined a section of collapsed rock, littered with shards of voidstone and the blackened remains of his drill rig. The Pit-Boss didn't just die. He unmade himself. The darkness, it devoured his very being. Elara, the weaver's apprentice, was a whirlwind of controlled fury. She was frantically directing a squad of elven scouts, weaving shimmering strands of shadow weave into a dense network around the perimeter of the salt flats, bolstering the shield formations. More conduits. Channel the residual darkness. We're feeding it, yes, but we're feeding it back. The success of their plan hinged on this desperate, almost frantic, return of shadow. The Grand Solar's initial onslaught had revealed the true nature of the eclipse, not a mindless devourer, but a being that thrived on the absence of shadow, a parasite on memory itself. To defeat it, they had to overwhelm it with their own darkness, to create an echo of absence so potent it would shatter the entity's fragile hold. But the eclipse was adapting. The initial bursts of chaotic energy had subsided, replaced by a chilling, calculated precision. Instead of shattering the null weaves, it began to actively drain them, pulling the shadows woven within like threads from a tapestry, leaving shimmering, empty patches in their wake. The voidstone projectiles, once explosive bursts of darkness, now fizzled out as they approached, their core energy neutralized. Then a new, unsettling change occurred. Small, shimmering figures began to coalesce within the white light, like disturbed dust motes given temporary form. These were not the distorted, fragmented shadows of captured soldiers. These were memories, raw and unformed, clinging desperately to the periphery of the eclipse's influence. "By the ancestors," Borak growled, hefting his hammer. "It's feeding on our recollections. It's trying to steal our past." Kalen, always the strategist, recognized the shift immediately. It's not just consuming shadow, it's consuming memory. That's why the Grand Solar and the Cartel were so successful. They weren't just draining shadows, they were stripping us of our history, our identities. Elara, her face etched with grim determination, responded, "Then we fight back with what remains. Every fleeting thought, every whispered prayer, every shared experience, we weave it into the weave. We become the antithesis of its hunger." Suddenly, a piercing shriek cut through the din of battle. One of the scout teams, spearheaded by Lyra, a young elven woman known for her sharp eyes and even sharper wit, fell silent. As they approached, they found her frozen, staring blankly at the white light, her eyes vacant. A thin, translucent figure, shimmering with an iridescent gray, floated before her, reaching out a spectral hand. "She has lost a memory," Alara whispered, her voice tight with horror. "A significant one. I can feel it, the echo of a loved one, a cherished moment gone." The figure then turned, its expression a chilling imitation of sorrow, and spoke, in a voice not its own, "Why fight the inevitable? Embrace the silence. The light is all that remains." Kalen stepped forward, drawing upon the power of his shadow-binding rune. He focused his will, attempting to sever the link between Lyra and the entity, but the effort was met with a jarring resistance. "It's stronger here," he gasped. "It's feeding on the remnants of her grief." Just as Lyra collapsed, completely devoid of memory, the Umbral Eclipse unleashed a final, devastating attack. A tendril of pure white energy lashed out, directly targeting Alara. She raised her hands instinctively, weaving a shield of shadow weave, but the force was too great. The weave fractured, throwing her backwards, and a wave of searing light washed over her. For a moment, everything went white. Kalen felt a wrenching, disorienting sensation, as if his own memories were being pulled away, scrutinized, judged. He saw fragments of his past, his father's lessons on shadowcraft, the faces of his fallen comrades, the hope he'd clung to for years. But they felt distant, faded, like looking at a portrait through a rain-streaked window. Then, with a gasp, he realized what was happening. The eclipse wasn't just stealing memories, it was altering them, twisting them, corrupting them, feeding on the doubt and fear that lay dormant within the hearts of even the most steadfast warriors. "It's a weapon of suggestion," Kalen shouted, rallying the remaining forces. "Don't fight the battle for our memories. Fight the battle against the temptation to lose them." The echo of absence had begun to truly resonate. The war for darkness had become a war for the very soul of existence. Chapter 7, The Inkblood Coup. The white remained, a suffocating absolute presence. It wasn't heat, not exactly. It was the absence of heat, of light, of everything that gave form to the world. The Basalt Spires, once stark monuments against the bleached sky, appeared as ghostly, incomplete sketches, their shadows utterly absent. Even the air felt heavy, thick with the chilling residue of the eclipse's touch. Kalen, battered and bleeding, rose to his feet, supported by a grizzled Orcish tunnel scout named Boric. Boric, a mountain of muscle and scarred leather, grunted, "The Weaver's apprentice is still breathing, little spark. Let's get her to the shelter." Alara lay a few feet away, her shadow-weave shield shards scattered around her like fallen stars. Her face was ashen, her movements sluggish, but her eyes held a flicker of defiance, a spark of the warrior she once was. The immediate threat of the searing light had passed, but the insidious effect of the eclipse lingered, a cold dread settling upon her mind. It's like a piece of me is gone," she whispered, her voice strained. I don't remember what I was fighting for." Kalen knelt beside her, his own disorientation growing. He could still see the fragments, the flashes of his father's teachings, a lifetime dedicated to the art of shadowcraft, the unwavering belief in their duty. And yet, they felt like echoes in a vast, empty chamber. He gripped her hand, seeking to anchor her, to remind her of who she was. "Don't give it to it, Alara," he urged, his voice raw with urgency. "It wants you to forget. It wants you to crumble. We fight for this, for the memory of what we are, for the right to cast a shadow." As if on cue, a low, guttural murmur spread through the ranks of the combined forces. Human oil burners, renowned for their stoicism, were fidgeting, their faces etched with doubt. Orcish tunnel scouts, normally unflinching, were glancing nervously at each other. Even the elven weavers, masters of illusion and perception, seemed unnerved, their movements hesitant. The echo of absence was amplified, feeding on the weakening resolve. The Umbral Eclipse was not simply consuming memories, it was systematically dismantling their identities. Suddenly, a guttural shout cut through the unsettling silence. "The Grand Solar!" Borak bellowed, pointing towards a plume of white smoke rising from the center of the battlefield. "Is gone silent. And his shield? It's collapsing?" Kalen understood immediately. The Darkwell amulet, the source of the Grand Solar's shielded shadow, was failing, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of returned darkness. The sudden influx of unadulterated shadow was causing a catastrophic reaction. "We need to act," Kalen said, his mind sharpening with a grim determination. "This isn't a battle of armies. It's a race against oblivion." He turned to Lyra, who, miraculously, was beginning to regain a semblance of her composure. "Lyra, you felt it too, didn't you? The pull? The suggestion?" Lyra nodded weakly. It was like a voice whispering promises of peace, of release from the burden of memory. "We need to neutralize his light," Kalen declared, his voice gaining strength. "Something to counter its power. Something to shatter the Darkwell." He glanced at the remaining supplies, a vast stockpile of coal tar collected from the ravaged landscapes, a legacy of the High Lantern Kingdom's ancient industry. An idea born of desperation and a sliver of intuition struck him. "Borak, gather the oil burners. Prepare to douse him with the tar. We need a concentrated assault, a drowning of light." As the oil burners, led by a grim-faced veteran named Reese, moved to implement the plan, Kalen turned to the Elven Weavers. "Eloan, I need you to focus your energy. We need a disruption, a concentrated burst of chaotic shadow weave to destabilize the Darkwell's remaining structure. We'll need to unravel its shield, expose it to the torrent." Eloan, despite her disorientation, responded with a focused intensity. She began to weave, her hands moving with a speed and precision that belied her weakened state. The air shimmered around her, and a tangible wave of dark energy pulsed outwards. The coup of the Inkblood was about to begin. It wasn't a glorious battle of swords and shields, but a desperate, improvised act of defiance, fueled by the last vestiges of memory and a chilling determination to reclaim the darkness and their souls. Chapter 8. The Weight of Black. The air in the Grand Solar's command tent, once a beacon of blinding white, now choked with the acrid scent of coal tar, was thick with tension. Reese and the oil burners, a squad of hardened warriors built for endurance and fueled by grim resolve, had successfully doused the Grand Solar Regent Valerius in a viscous black tide. The effect was immediate. The artificial light that pulsed from the Regent's chest, a carefully crafted construct of concentrated sunlight, filtered through crystalline lenses, sputtered, flickered, and died, leaving him a shivering husk beneath a sheen of oily darkness. The Darkwell amulet, a complex lattice of obsidian and silver, lay shattered at his feet, a testament to the devastating power of unrefined black. But the victory felt fragile. Valerius, despite his stunned silence, remained unnervingly calm, a chillingly polite expression plastered across his face. He hadn't moved, hadn't attempted any of the arcane defenses had been trained to deploy. Kalen suspected the deluge of tar had overloaded the Darkwell, not destroyed it. The amulet's structure is compromised, but it's still retaining a significant concentration of shadow, Kalen observed, examining the fragments with a critical eye. "It's like trying to hold a storm in a nutshell." Reese, his face smeared with tar and streaked with sweat, grunted. "Then we drown it some more." He gestured to the oil burners, who were meticulously applying fresh layers of coal tar to the broken fragments, their movements slow and deliberate, as if channeling all their strength into the task. Meanwhile, Eloan's weave-sunder spell continued to pulse, a chaotic symphony of dark energy. The air around her thrummed with a palpable instability. The weft-sunder, normally a precise tool for manipulating the threads of shadow, felt wildly out of control, like trying to contain a raging river with a sieve. She was struggling to maintain coherence, the echoes of the Umbral Eclipse's voice still murmuring in her mind, attempting to lull her into a deeper silence. "The shield is fluctuating, Kaelin," Elowen shouted, her voice strained. "It's resisting, feeding on the excess darkness. The more we unleash, the stronger it becomes." Kaelin felt a knot of despair tighten in his stomach. Had understood the theory of focused disruption to shatter the dark well's structural integrity, but the reality was proving far more resistant. He realized they were fighting a battle on multiple fronts, a desperate game of containment against an entity that was learning, adapting to their tactics. Just then, a guttural roar echoed from the depths of the command tent. Borak, the Orcish tunnel scout, a towering figure of muscle and scarred steel, burst through the makeshift barricades formed by the oil burners. He was followed by a contingent of tunnel scouts, their faces grim, their hands gripping crude, drilling rigs repurposed mining tools from the Deep-Cavern Clan. "The Pit-Boss encampment," Borak bellowed, his voice thick with the dampness of the subterranean caverns. "He's been expecting this. He has reinforced his defenses. The dark well is feeding him." Kaelin swore under his breath. The Silhouette Cartel wasn't merely directing their armies, they were actively manipulating the environment, exploiting the natural vulnerabilities of each race. The Pit-Boss, known as Krog, was a master of subterranean warfare, and he was using his vast network of tunnels and drilling rigs to directly channel shadow energy into his own dark well aim. "We need to cut off his supply line," Kaelin ordered, his voice tight with urgency. "Rhys, focus on containing Valerius. Elowen, keep the Weave Sunder active, but be careful. Borak, lead a flanking maneuver. Target Krog's main drilling, rig number 7. Disrupt the flow." As the oil burners and tunnel scouts prepared to execute their flanking maneuvers, a horrifying realization dawned on Kaelin. The Umbral Eclipse hadn't just been stealing memories, it was consuming the potential for memory. The very act of fighting, of trying to reclaim the shadows, was feeding the entity's power. He looked at his weary warriors, at the flickering Darkwell amulets, at the chaos of the tent, and understood. They weren't just fighting a war, they were participating in a carefully orchestrated ritual of oblivion. "We're running out of time," Kaelin said, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to do something drastic. Something unexpected." He glanced at the scattered remnants of the High Lantern Kingdom's industry, the coal tar, the intricate clockwork mechanisms salvaged from ancient workshops, the tools of a forgotten age. An idea, born not of strategy, but of desperate intuition, sparked within him. "Rhys, I want you to set the tar ablaze. Everything." Chapter 9, Ink Blood. The order was delivered with the weight of a dying star. Rhys, the tunnel scout, a young orc with a disconcerting calm beneath his scarred face, didn't hesitate. He barked commands in guttural Orcish, his hand already gripping the sparking flintlock head salvaged from a downed human patrol. Within moments, a dozen oil burners, fueled by a primal desperation, began to feverishly coat the salvaged machinery, the discarded weapons, even the worn tents, with thick, viscous coal tar. The air thickened with the acrid scent, a black fog rolling across the salt flats. Kaelin watched, a grim satisfaction warring with a rising dread. "Borak, maintain the perimeter. Don't let Krog scouts through," he barked, his hand resting on the hilt of his sunblade, its polished surface reflecting the unnatural white of the sky. The blade, a relic of a time when the High Lantern still held dominion, was said to absorb light, a crude but potent countermeasure. The initial response from Krog's forces was predictable: a furious, coordinated assault. Tunnel scouts, clad in segmented steel armor and wielding drilling hammers, surged forward, attempting to cut off the oil burners' advance. But Reese had anticipated them. Had positioned a series of strategically placed explosive charges, triggered by the initial flames, creating localized collapses and choking tunnels. The Orcish assault faltered, hampered by the spreading inferno. Focus the heat! Concentrate the flames! Kalen roared, driving his sunblade into the ground, channeling a meager trickle of light to bolster the burning tar. The black liquid sputtered and hissed, instantly consuming anything it touched, spitting out tendrils of smoke that briefly obscured the battlefield. But the Pit-Boss remained unnervingly calm. From the depths of the sprawling drilling complex, a tremor ran not of earth, but of focused energy. Krog, encased in a shimmering field of shadow, was drawing on the raw, stolen potential of the entire operation, amplifying his Darkwell amulet's influence. The flames, instead of consuming, seemed to invigorate him, strengthening his defenses. Suddenly, a chilling realization struck Kalen. The Umbral Eclipse wasn't just an observer, it was feeding on their desperation. Every panicked command, every desperate act of defiance, was fueling the entity's growth, solidifying its hold on the shattered remnants of memory. The very act of fighting to reclaim the shadows was strengthening the darkness. "Stop!" Kalen yelled, his voice strained. "The tar, it's not working. It's amplifying his power." Reese, momentarily stunned, hesitated, his hand frozen above his flintlock. "What do you mean, Commander?" "It is absorbing the heat, the energy we're generating. The flames aren't destroying him, they're feeding him." Kalen's eyes scanned the battlefield, taking in the frantic efforts of the oil burners, the collapsing tunnels, the desperate attempts to hold back the tide. "We're creating a mirror image of the eclipse, a parasitic echo. We need to break the cycle." An idea, raw and desperate, slammed into Kalen with the force of a collapsing shaft. It wasn't about brute force, not anymore. It was about negation, about the antithesis of light. "Elowen!" he shouted, turning to the Elven Weaver's apprentice, who was frantically trying to stabilize the Weave Sunder spell. "I need you to shift the focus. Don't try to unravel his silhouette. Amplify the darkness." Elowen, a slender elf with eyes the color of twilight, looked at him in bewildered confusion. "But the Shade-Stitcher, her shadows are still connected to him. Severing them is our only chance." "No," Kalen roared, ignoring her protest. "We need to flood his defenses with absence. Shift the Weave Sunder to actively absorb the shadows, not destroy them. Concentrate on generating a localized null space around his dark well." As Elowen, driven by a newfound urgency, began to manipulate the intricate patterns of the Weave Sunder, a strange phenomenon began to occur. The flames surrounding Krog's shield flickered, sputtered, and began to die. The shimmering field around him wavered, weakened. It wasn't a direct attack, but a gradual, insidious erosion of the very fabric of his defense. The concentrated darkness, born of Elowen's amplified spell, was starving his stolen shadows. Seeing his advantage, Kalen gave the final order. "Barak! Detonate the remaining charges! Now!" The salt flats erupted in a series of synchronized explosions. The ground beneath Krog's drilling rig buckled, collapsing with a deafening roar. The massive machinery, already weakened by the tar, was instantly entombed in a deep, absolute cavern of darkness, a darkness utterly devoid of light, devoid of memory, devoid of the Umbral Eclipse's influence. Krog, trapped within his self-made prison, screamed a wordless cry of fury as the Darkwell amulet, deprived of its stolen energy source, imploded with a silent, devastating flash. Chapter 10. The Echo of Nothing. The dust settled, thick and gray, coating the remnants of Krog's demise. A silence descended upon the salt flats, heavier than the oppressive heat, broken only by the ragged breathing of the three heroes. Elowen, her face streaked with grime and exhaustion, meticulously adjusted the weave sunder, the air around her shimmering with an unnatural violet hue. Galen, his oil-stained leather face grim, surveyed the scene, a circular pit carved deep into the salt, the skeletal remains of a colossal, drilling rig clawing at the sky, and at its center, a wisp of smoke rising from the shattered fragments of Krog's dark well, and impressive, he conceded, his voice raspy, utterly brutal, and surprisingly effective. Beside him, Borak, the Orcish tunnel scout, grunted, hefting a salvaged axe. Waste of good metal. Shoulda just smashed him. Brute force doesn't unravel the weave, Borak, Eloan countered, her eyes still focused on the receding shimmer of the spell. This wasn't about killing him, it was about severing the connection. About turning his own defenses against him. The air held a disconcerting stillness. The light, still filtered through the remnants of the charcoal smoke screens, seemed to hesitate, as if reluctant to penetrate the newly formed void. It was a silence imbued with a profound sadness, a palpable absence of memory. The cartel's strategy was elegant in its cruelty, Kalen observed, running a hand through his dark hair. They weren't actively feeding the eclipse, they were draining our shadows, making us vulnerable, and then offering us a false sense of security. A gilded cage of borrowed darkness. He shifted his gaze towards the horizon, where the towering basalt spires, the last vestiges of true shadow in this blighted land, stood stark and silent. The Umbral Eclipse is still there, of course, but weakened, severed. Its influence is fractured. Suddenly, a low tremor ran through the salt flats, accompanied by a high-pitched whine, the residual resonance of the trapped machinery. Eloan flinched, instinctively reaching out with her hands. Something's reacting, she said, her voice tight with concentration. The null space, it's unstable. It's attempting to fill itself. Kalen stepped forward, examining the pit. The collapse created a vacuum, a pocket of absolute nothing. And the weave, being inherently responsive to the absence of light, is attempting to construct something in its place. It's trying to recreate what was lost shadow. As he spoke, a faint swirling mist began to coalesce at the bottom of the pit. It wasn't a vaporous cloud, but a tangible distortion of the air, a ripple in reality itself. Within the mist, shimmering outlines began to form, fragments of Krog's drilling rig, partially reconstructed, almost as if pulled from a forgotten dream. It's not just shadow, Eloan gasped, her eyes wide with horrified understanding. It's information. The weave is pulling back the echoes of his actions, reconstructing his last moments. Feeding on the residual energy of his despair, it's creating a localized history. The mist thickened, and a ghostly image of Krog appeared within it, a spectral silhouette, frozen in the agonizing moment of his demise. He reached out, his hand shimmering, as if trying to grasp at something just beyond his reach. The image flickered violently, distorted by the encroaching null space, before collapsing back into the swirling gray. "We need to interrupt it," Kalen shouted, drawing his obsidian blade. "The weave isn't just reversing the damage, it's amplifying the eclipse's power. It's feeding it the memory of Krog's suffering." He lunged into the pit, his blade a streak of darkness against the ethereal mist. As he slashed at the emerging forms, the mist recoiled, momentarily dispersing. But with each attack, the distorted image of Krog grew stronger, more defined. "It's a feedback loop," Eloan cried, desperately adjusting the weave sunder. "The more we disrupt the reconstruction, the stronger the echoes become." Borak, understanding the urgency, unleashed a volley of crude ballista-fired stones at the pit, attempting to break the flow of the weave. The stones met with little effect against the unstable structure, only momentarily disrupting the swirling mist. Kalen, despite his efforts, found himself struggling against an unseen force. He felt a strange disorientation, a growing sense of unease, as if his own memories were being subtly altered, fragmented and absorbed by the swirling vortex. "Don't fight the weave, Kaelin!" Elowen yelled over the din. "Fight the source! We need to isolate the null space, create a tighter containment field." As she spoke, she channeled all her remaining power into the weave sunder, focusing on a single desperate act of containment. The violet light intensified, and a sphere of absolute darkness began to expand outwards, pushing back against the chaotic reconstruction of Krog's prison. The ghostly image of Krog shrieked a silent, spectral cry of rage and agony, and then, with a final, desperate flicker, vanished completely. The swirling mist dissipated, leaving only the echoing silence of the salt flats and the unsettling certainty that, even in the deepest darkness, the memory of the Umbral Eclipse could find a way to endure. Chapter 11. Echoes in Obsidian. The silence after Krog's disappearance wasn't peaceful. It was a thick, viscous thing, heavy with the residue of a battle fought not with steel and magic, but with the very fabric of reality. The salt flats stretched around them, a monochrome expanse of obsidian reflecting the agonizingly bright sky. A sky that felt less like a sun, and more like the unblinking gaze of a cosmic horror. Dust motes danced in the light, each one a tiny phantom, a fragment of a stolen memory. "It's quieter," Borak observed, his normally guttural voice subdued. He shifted the heavy frame of his drill rig, the metal slick with condensation and a strange, unsettling film. "The weave feels thinner." Kaelin, leaning heavily on his staff, the polished obsidian cool against his skin, nodded slowly. The disorientation hadn't entirely vanished, but the insistent, subtly shifting sensation of his memories had subsided. "The vortex is contained, for now." "Elowen, how stable is the sphere?" Elowen, her face streaked with soot and exhaustion, ran a diagnostic hand over the intricately woven runes etched into her weave sunder amulet. The violet light pulsing from the device flickered erratically. "Holding. But it's fragile. The echoes they're still attempting to rebuild. Each surge of reconstruction is stronger, more determined. We're not just containing the damage, we're actively pushing back against a force that seems to understand how to become us." She glanced at Kaelin, a flicker of genuine concern in her usually serene blue eyes. "The Umbral Eclipse isn't just feeding on memories. It's learning to rewrite them, to mold us into a vessel for its complete dominance." Suddenly, a low grinding rumble echoed across the salt flats. The ground beneath their feet vibrated, and the surface began to ripple with heat haze. The dark well amulets around their necks flared with a sickly blue light, warning of an impending disruption. "Pit-Boss is attempting to re-establish a connection," Borak roared, scrambling to operate the controls of his drilling rig. "He's trying to reinforce the void we created." The Pit-Boss, formerly a terrifying figure known as Vorlag, was now a horrifying spectacle, a skeletal husk, encased in blackened, pulsating metal, his eyes glowing with a malevolent, internalized light. Had been utterly crushed beneath his machinery, but the Umbral Eclipse hadn't taken him, it had absorbed him, using his ambition and rage as a conduit. Vorlag's voice, a rasping echo of corrupted metal, filled their minds not through spoken words, but through a raw, insistent surge of stolen thought. "You cannot stop the inevitable. Darkness is the natural order. Your paltry shadows cling to a dying world. I will reshape it." He unleashed a wave of corrupted energy, a sickly green tendril that slammed into the weave sunder. The violet light sputtered, and a jagged tear appeared in the containment sphere. Fragments of swirling mist, thick with distorted faces and fractured landscapes, began to bleed into the space. "The echoes are manifesting," Kaelin shouted, instinctively raising his staff. He channeled a defensive ward, a shimmering shield of condensed shadow that deflected the green tendril. "Elowen, reinforce the sphere. Now!" As Elowen worked frantically, Channeling the remaining power of the Weave Sunder, Boric realized the horrifying truth. Vorlag wasn't just trying to rebuild the prison, he was trying to rebuild himself. He was leveraging the remnants of their shattered memories, attempting to coalesce a new, more potent form. "He's using our fear," Borak yelled, his voice laced with panic. "He's feeding on our doubt, our regret. That's why the reconstruction is so aggressive." Kalen, drawing on a deeper well of strength, began to chant in the ancient elven tongue, a complex invocation designed to disrupt the flow of corrupted energy. The obsidian staff pulsed with a vibrant violet light, amplifying his spell. The fragmented landscapes within the swirling mist began to coalesce, forming fleeting glimpses of a terrifying half-remembered world, a world consumed by unending shadows. Suddenly, a new presence joined them, a figure emerging from the swirling darkness. It was an orc, a young scout named Rorik, who'd initially arrived at the Salt Flats searching for signs of the cartel. He wore the faded gray uniform of the Deep-Cavern Clan, but his eyes held a haunted, vacant look. He was clutching a small, intricately carved bone charm, a miniature shadow lantern, its light long extinguished. I don't understand," Rorik whispered, his voice trembling. "I saw my father. He was fading, like a drawing erased by rain. He said, 'Don't look at the light. It wants your memories.'" He looked up at the terrifying brightness of the sky, a flicker of understanding dawning in his eyes. "The shadow is not a thing to be destroyed. It's a part of us. It is us." Just then, the containment sphere shattered completely. A torrent of chaotic energy erupted, engulfing them all in a blinding violet light. As the light subsided, Krog stood before them, no longer a ghostly projection, but a solid, albeit weakened, warrior. But something was different. A subtle shift in his demeanor, a deeper resonance in his eyes. He seemed fuller, more complete. "The echoes have been silenced," Krog said, his voice imbued with an ancient, knowing quality. "But the fight, it has only just begun." Chapter 12. The weight of ink, the violet afterglow of the containment sphere's collapse clung to the salt flats like a shroud, smelling of ozone and something acrid like burnt bone. "Jeez!" Dust motes danced in the returning sunlight, now a harsh, almost aggressive presence after weeks of bleached, muted light. Krog, solid and tangible, surveyed the scene with a weary intensity. Beside him, Elias, the human oil burner, coughed, spitting out grit. Lyra, the elven weaver's apprentice, was already meticulously examining the shattered remains of the sphere, her fingers tracing the intricate runes etched into its surface. And Rorik, still clutching his extinguished shadow lantern, remained a quiet, unsettling presence, a ghost amongst the living. "The energy signature, it's gone," Lyra reported, her voice tight. "The residue of the Umbral Eclipse's influence is fading, but not entirely. There's a lingering hunger." Elias, a man built of muscle and pragmatism, grunted. "Hunger for what? More shadows?" "Perhaps," Elias replied, his gaze sweeping over the ravaged landscape. "Or perhaps something far more insidious. The cartel didn't just steal our shadows, they stole our memories connected to them." Rorik, shaken by his encounter with his fading father, finally spoke, his voice gaining a fragile strength. "The cartel, they aren't just trying to make us shadowless. They're trying to erase us." Suddenly, a guttural growl echoed across the salt flats. From behind a ridge of blackened shale, a patrol of Deep-Cavern Clan warriors led by Grook, the veteran tunnel scout, emerged. Rook, a towering orc with scarred skin and a perpetually grim expression, was a man of few words, but his loyalty to the clan was absolute. "We've found traces," Grook stated, his voice a rumble. "The remnants of the Grand Solar's shield tech. Scattered, degraded, but undeniably designed to strip away shadow. And something else, an unnatural stillness. The air feels hollow. The silhouette amulets were clearly designed to create a vacuum, Elias said, his hand instinctively reaching for the coal tar torch he always carried. It's a horrifyingly efficient method of control. Efficient but flawed, Lyra countered, examining a small shard of black glass recovered from the sphere. The act of forcibly detaching a shadow creates a feedback loop, a resonance. The more shadows removed, the stronger the resonance becomes, feeding the eclipse's hunger. As she spoke, a collective shudder ran through the group. The air seemed to vibrate with a low, mournful hum. Rorik, clutching his shadow lantern, stumbled backwards, his eyes wide with terror. It's calling to me," he whispered, his voice choked with fear. "The shadows, they're screaming." Krog, ever watchful, stepped forward. "The echoes are amplified here, young one. The residue of countless lost memories. Don't fight it, Rorik. Understand it. The shadows are not enemies. They are the vessel of our stories, our identities, our connection to the world." He reached out, placing a heavy hand on Rorik's shoulder. "The cartel seeks to silence these voices. We must ensure they are not forgotten." As he spoke, Elias, ever the pragmatist, noticed something. "Look," he said, pointing to a series of strangely arranged stones surrounding a small, perfectly circular depression in the salt. These were deliberately placed. A focal point. Someone was conducting rituals. Lyra knelt, examining the stones. They were made of a dark, porous stone, unlike anything found in the immediate area. "These are shadow stone," she declared, her voice filled with grim knowledge. "Rare and incredibly potent. They amplify and channel the resonance of lost shadows." The cartel wasn't simply stealing shadows, they were actively feeding the eclipse with our collective grief and regret. Suddenly, a faint shimmer appeared above the circular depression. A humanoid silhouette began to coalesce, flickering like a dying flame. It wasn't solid, but a suggestion of a person, a ghost made of shadow and regret. A young human woman, her face etched with a heartbreaking sadness, reached out a translucent hand. "Don't," she whispered, her voice a mournful sigh. "Don't let them forget. They'll erase you everything." Before anyone could react, a volley of arrows, tipped with obsidian and coated in a viscous black resin, erupted from the surrounding rocks. Grook and his warriors responded with a hail of steel, but the arrows seemed to pass harmlessly through the spectral figure. Krog reacted instantly, unleashing a wave of raw, channeled darkness, momentarily disrupting the spectral projection. But as the projection dissipated, a chilling realization dawned upon them all. The cartel hadn't just been stealing memories. They had been creating new ones, memories of despair, of loss, of oblivion, designed to further fuel the eclipse's hunger. "They're weaponizing our grief," Elias breathed, his face pale with horror. The fight for the shadows had just taken on a terrifying new dimension. Chapter 13. The Echo Chamber. The air in the obsidian basin hung thick with the residue of the unraveling. The scent of crushed pitch mingled with the metallic tang of blood, human, orc, and elven, a grim perfume of desperate action. Grook, his face smeared with soot and etched with a grim satisfaction, barked orders, directing the immediate cleanup of the collapsed drilling rigs. The Orcish tunnel scouts were already reinforcing the perimeter, their massive axes hacking at the exposed rock, ensuring the Pit-Boss' final resting place wouldn't cave in and bury them alive. Krog, ever the strategist, remained motionless, observing. The spectacle of the cartel's demise, the smoldering husk of Grand Solar Vorin, the choked darkness clinging to the jaws of Pit-Boss Cathar, and the dissipated pool of black ink where Shade-Stitcher Lyra once stood felt incomplete. It wasn't the victory they'd anticipate. "It's not over," Elias stated, his voice low, a thread of ice in the recovering heat of the basin. They didn't just fall. They shifted. This wasn't a battle, it was an echoing chamber. He gestured to the shimmering, obsidian-strewn ground. Where the spectral woman had stood, the air still held a faint, nauseating stillness. The scattered fragments of Lyra's cloak shimmering, iridescent silks woven with captured shadows, pulsed with a sickly luminescence. The resonance stones, Grook grunted, picking up a small, fist-sized stone, radiating a faint, pulsating darkness. The Shadow Stone. It's real, and it's amplifying the echoes. The Shadow Stone, discovered after a frantic, desperate scramble through the ruined depths of the cartel's research chamber, was the key to understanding the true horror. Previously Shadow Stone, she declared, her voice filled with grim knowledge. Rare and incredibly potent. They amplify and channel the resonance of lost shadows. The cartel wasn't simply stealing shadows, they were actively feeding the eclipse with our collective grief and regret. Suddenly, a faint shimmer appeared above the circular depression. A humanoid silhouette began to coalesce, flickering like a dying flame. It wasn't solid, but a suggestion of a person, a ghost made of shadow and regret. A young human woman, her face etched with a heartbreaking sadness, reached out a translucent hand. "Don't," she whispered, her voice a mournful sigh. "Don't let them forget. They'll erase you everything." Before anyone could react, a volley of arrows, tipped with obsidian and coated in a viscous black resin, erupted from the surrounding rock. Grook and his warriors responded with a hail of steel, but the arrows seemed to pass harmlessly through the spectral figure. Krog reacted instantly, unleashing a wave of raw-channeled darkness, momentarily disrupting the spectral projection. But as the projection dissipated, a chilling realization dawned upon them all. The cartel hadn't just been stealing memories. They'd been creating new ones, memories of despair, of loss, of oblivion, designed to further fuel the eclipse's hunger. "They're weaponizing our grief," Elias breathed, his face pale with horror. The fight for the shadows had just taken on a terrifying new dimension. Now holding the Shadow Stone, Grook felt it. A dizzying rush of disjointed images, a child's lost toy, a soldier's final breath, a lover's heartbroken farewell, slammed into his mind, each amplified 100-fold. He stumbled, clutching his head, as the echoes of 1,000 forgotten sorrows threatened to overwhelm him. "The Stonet's drawing them in," Krog said, his voice strained. "It's feeding the darkness, not just amplifying it. The spectral forms they are in, just echoes. They're constructed echoes, born from the lingering trauma of the shadowless world." Elias, ever the scholar, cautiously approached the shimmering distortion above the basin. He carefully touched the Shadow Stone to the residual energy. Immediately, the shimmering intensified, and a new projection solidified a grizzled Orcish veteran, clad in battered plate armor, his face a mask of unending regret. He raised a spectral axe, his movements jerky and unnatural, and let out a silent scream of anguish. "He was slain at the Battle of Black Falls," Elias whispered, his voice filled with a horrified fascination. "Lost to the Shadowborn. The cartel dive resurrected his pain, weaponized it." The realization crashed over them with the force of a tidal wave. The cartel hadn't simply stolen shadows, they'd manipulated them, twisting the very essence of loss into a tool of destruction. "We have to sever the connection," Krog declared, his expression grim. "The stone is the source. Destroy it." But as Grook raised his axe, intending to smash the Shadow Stone, the spectral veteran lurched forward, his translucent axe swinging with terrifying force. The air around them thickened, the echoes intensified, and suddenly they were all lost, drowning in the cacophony of stolen sorrow, battling not just an external threat, but the very darkness within themselves. Chapter 14. The ink-blood coup. The disorientation lingered, a dull throb behind Elias' eye. He tasted metal, the phantom tang of Grook's axe striking the Shadowstone, the spectral veteran's chilling scream. Around them, the basin pulsed with a frantic, fractured energy, a swirling vortex of projected anguish. Krog, ever the pragmatist, was already shifting his stance, the rune-carved grip of his warhammer humming with restrained power. "It's not just projecting memories, it's amplifying them," he growled, his voice strained. "The stone isn't merely a reservoir, it's a forge. They're hammering the darkest moments of our histories into something tangible, something weaponizable." Grook, usually a bastion of stoic Orcish fury, was visibly shaken. The echoes weren't just assaulting his senses, he felt a visceral connection to the tormented warrior, a mirroring of his own fears and regrets. He gripped his axe tighter, the polished steel gleaming under the sickly, shimmering light cast by the distorted sky. The Shadowborn there are not just ghosts. They're use, but broken. Elias, drawing on his years of studying the ancient lore, realized the horrifying truth. The Silhouette Cartel hadn't just sought to steal shadows, they were actively shaping them, distilling the raw essence of despair into a potent weapon. The Luminous Grace wasn't a gift. It was a parasitic bloom, feeding on the planet's history, twisting it into a horrific imitation of life. "We need a disruption," Elias said, his voice urgent. "Something to shatter the amplification. Something unnatural." He remembered a passage from the Obsidian Codex, a forbidden text detailing the creation of ink-blood, a volatile concoction capable of nullifying magical resonance. Coal tar, refined to an unprecedented density, combined with a specific sequence of elemental binding sit, could create a counter-resonance, a void in the stone's energy. Krog, after a moment of consideration, nodded. "It's a gamble. The Codex speaks of unpredictable reactions. But we're running out of options. Grook, prepare the bellows. We need to distill the tar. Elias, you'll oversee the binding sequence." Working with a desperate urgency, they set to work. Grook, with his innate understanding of heat and pressure, expertly manipulated the bellows, feeding the immense furnace crafted from salvaged High Lantern forge equipment. Elias, guided by the Codex cryptic instructions, carefully layered the meticulously prepared bindings, powdered moonstone, crushed dragon scale, and the distilled essence of a rare subterranean fungi into the swirling viscous tar. The air thickened with a cloying, acrid scent, the color deepening from a murky gray to a terrifying, inky black. As the ink blood reached its peak concentration, it began to shimmer with an unsettling energy, a miniature vortex of darkness mirroring the one above the basin. They knew this was their window. Meanwhile, a tense debate raged amongst the assembled forces. The human banner, still reeling from the shock of their commander's betrayal, was spearheaded by Commander Valeria, a veteran of countless battles, her face etched with grim determination. The Orcish contingent, led by the formidable war chieftain Baruch, bristled with controlled aggression, their massive war machines a silent testament to their brutal power. The Elven delegation, represented by the elegant and enigmatic Lyra, the Weaver's apprentice, argued for a more strategic approach, advocating for a slow, methodical unraveling of the Elven Shade-Stitcher's net. "We cannot simply rush in," Lyra argued, her voice like the rustle of silk. "The cartel will anticipate our moves. We need to understand the flow of information, to disrupt their communications, to isolate them. Sentimentality will be our undoing," Valeria countered, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. "They've poisoned our shadows, corrupted our loyalties. We must strike with decisive force." Krog, sensing the growing discord, intervened. "Enough. We are united in this. The cartel's manipulation has exploited our divisions. Now we finish what they started." He raised his hammer, a signal that cut through the argument. "The Coup begins now. With a coordinated roar, the three armies surged forward, their movements precise and brutal. Grog, Elias, and Grook, leading the charge, reached the Shadow Stone. Grook raised his axe, intent on smashing the stone, but a spectral warrior materialized before him, a chilling echo of a fallen Orcish hero. The battle became a maelstrom of spectral combat. Warriors from all three races locked in desperate struggles against their own tormented pasts. Then, with a final, desperate heave, Krog brought his hammer down upon the Inkblood, unleashing a torrent of black energy that slammed into the Shadowstone. The stone shuddered, crackled, and finally, with a sound like the shattering of 1,000 souls, imploded. The spectral warrior dissolved, the vortex above the basin wavered, and the horrifying cacophony of stolen sorrow abruptly ceased. Chapter 15. The Echo of Shattered Souls. The air in the Basin of Whispers tasted of burnt bone and regret. The immediate aftermath of the Inkblood's impact was a shimmering haze, a residual echo of the torrent of unleashed memories and shattered identities. The spectral warriors, once grotesque reflections of Orcish valor and Elven grace, flickered and dissolved, leaving only a fine dusting of black ash on the crimson sandstone. Krog, his breath ragged, leaned heavily on his hammer, its head slick with the viscous, cooling Inkblood. Elias, ever the pragmatist, was already scanning the perimeter, his oil-stained eyes narrowed, assessing the damage. The stone's integrity is gone. Completely. It's a void now, a hole punched through reality itself. Grook, usually a whirlwind of brute force, stood silently, the metallic scent of his axe clinging to him. He was wrestling with the echoes of the spectral warrior, a young orc named Buruk, a legend amongst the Deep-Cavern Clan, a warrior who died defending their ancestral tunnels from a rival tribe. Buruk's spectral manifestation had been unnervingly perfect, a chilling reminder of the cartel's ability to weaponize grief and exploit the deepest wounds of their own soldiers. "It's him," Grook finally grunted, his voice thick with a nascent sorrow. "He's trapped." A fragment of himself, clinging to the void. Suddenly, a high-pitched keening filled the basin. Lyra, her silver hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, rushed towards the epicenter of the disruption. Her face, normally a mask of calculated strategy, was etched with a horrifying realization. "The Darkwell amulets!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the remnants of the Shadow Stone. "They're not just holding the shadows, they're amplifying the echoes. The stolen memories there feeding the void, trying to reconstitute themselves." The problem was becoming terrifyingly clear. The Inkblood hadn't just destroyed the stone, it had released a flood of raw, unprocessed emotion, a chaotic swarm of shattered narratives that the amulet's protective field was desperately struggling to contain. The cartel hadn't simply stolen shadows, they'd built a miniature, agonizing universe within the basin, a pocket dimension powered by the collective despair of countless warriors. "We have to sever the connection." Valeria barked, her movements precise and deadly. She activated the last of her sunstone charms, focusing their concentrated light on the shattered remains of the Inkblood. But the effect was minimal, the chaotic energy radiating outwards like a malevolent heat. "The amulets are adapting. They're learning to channel the flow." Elias, observing the escalating chaos, had a grim idea. "The pitch. We need more." A concentrated blast, aimed directly at the amulet's core. It was a risky proposition. Unrefined coal tar was a volatile substance, notoriously difficult to control, and even a small miscalculation could trigger a catastrophic explosion. But with the void of the Shadowstone amplifying the stolen memories, they were running out of options. Krog, his eyes narrowed with grim determination, commanded, "Grook, prepare a saturation bomb. Elias, coordinate the delivery. Lyra, I need you to analyze the energy signatures, find the point of greatest amplification." Working with a terrifying efficiency born of desperation, the three races mobilized. Gruk, his muscular frame a blur of motion, began loading the massive cauldrons with pitch, his movements echoing the rhythm of a primal, violent prayer. Elias, using his knowledge of combustion and his mastery of oil-based weaponry, oversaw the assembly of a series of specialized incendiary barrels, each one calibrated to release a controlled burst of black smoke. Lyra, utilizing a device fashioned from salvaged Darkwell fragments and refined by elven craftsmanship, began to sift through the chaotic energy signatures, pinpointing the precise point where the echoes of the spectral warriors were most intensely concentrated. As the final barrel was loaded, a shimmering tendril of black energy lashed out from the remnants of the Shadowstone, attempting to seize Gruk. But he was ready, his hammer a whirlwind of force, shattering the tendril and sending it reeling back into the void. Now, Krog roared, unleashing a devastating hammer blow. Gruk hurled the incendiary barrel directly at the focal point of the amplified echoes, and Elias triggered the mechanism. A geyser of black smoke erupted, engulfing the three Darkwell amulets in a suffocating cloud. The keening intensified, reaching a fever pitch, and then silence. The shimmering haze dissipated, revealing the amulets, shattered and inert. The spectral warriors vanished completely, leaving only the fine dusting of black ash. But the victory was short-lived. As the last of the smoke cleared, a new form began to coalesce within the void of the Shadowstone, not a warrior, but something far more unsettling, a swirling vortex of pure, concentrated shadow, pulsing with an unnerving intelligence. "It's adapting," Lyra gasped, her voice strained. "The void, it's not empty. It's learning." Krog understood immediately. The cartel hadn't simply broken the Shadowstone, they'd opened a conduit, a doorway to the Umbral Eclipse itself. The void wasn't a trap, it was an invitation. And whatever was emerging from it wasn't a warrior, but something far older, far more terrifying, and infinitely more hungry. The coup had succeeded in severing the cartel's power, but the true battle, they realized with a chilling certainty, had only just begun.